Nothing But the Truth. Hello, I'm Raj Chengappa of India Today and your host for Nothing But the Truth. This is my weekly x-ray of key issues that matter to you without holding back on the truth. In this episode, we go to one of India's last great wildernesses, the Great Nicobar Island, where the National Green Tribunal, or NGT, has just given the green light to go ahead with the mammoth rupees 81,000 crore port and defense project proposed by the central government. The Modi government calls the project strategic, transformational, and says it's a maritime gateway that will strengthen India's reach in the Indian Ocean. Now, ecologists and several experts fear something else. They say that this project could permanently alter a UNESCO-protected biosphere, it could damage rare ecosystems and disrupt indigenous communities whose lives are intimately interwoven with the island's forests. So we will look at power, both economic and strategic power, as well as the power of nature itself, and analyze what India gains and what India might lose permanently. Let me just give you an idea of Galathea Bay at the edge of the Great Nicobar Island, where the giant commercial port costing rupees 44,000 crore is to come up. Now, if you visit it by day, Galathea Bay is a crescent of sand at the wild frontier of the Great Nicobar. The Indian Ocean here shifts between deep blues and bright emerald colors. It's a sight to see. Now, behind the beach rise dense tropical forests, alive, teeming with flora and fauna found nowhere else in the world. Clear streams and beautiful waterfalls slice through the green forest, emptying into mangrove-lined creeks, and if you stay back in the quiet estuaries, the saltwater crocodiles bask, and you can see them do so. Now, these months, February and March, is the dry season. Here, the air hangs hot and humid, but at night, the island changes. The beach turns cool, and there is a hushed silence. The sea darkens and turns darker, and moonlight lays a silver path across the water. And then, from the depths of the sea, something immense emerges and drags itself ashore. It is a leatherback turtle. It is 2 meters long, that's almost 8 feet, and it weighs over 400 kilograms. It is one of the largest sea turtles on Earth. And by a marvel of nature, this female leatherback turtle has swum more than 6,000 kilometers from the Australian coast. It is a solitary journey of over 6 months, and magically, it is guided by a magnetic imprint etched into her brain to ensure that she returns to the very beach of her birth. It is embedded, and that's the incredible part of nature, that she finds a way without any compasses, without anything, just this magnetic pole that seems to guide her towards the place of her birth, and where she will now, as she proceeds, her flippers carve deep furrows in the sand, and she finds, as she searches for the right patch, and then she lowers nearly 100 eggs into a hidden chamber. Now, this is a primeval ritual that once and has now made Galathea Bay the largest nesting ground for giant leatherback turtles in Southeast Asia. It's the largest nesting ground that is there in this particular region. And now this beach, Galathea Beach, this ancient theater of survival, sits at the center of a major national controversy. Mind you, the leatherback turtles are not the only ones that are under threat. The Great Nicobar Island is a living archive of biodiversity, and if you go there, you will find the Nicobar megapode. It's a chicken-sized bird named for its unusually large feet. Now, this bird builds mound nests on the forest floor, and it is a sight to see and is considered a keystone species in the island's fragile ecology. There is also the Nicobar macaque, the giant robber crabs, just to name a few, rare butterflies, orchids. And offshore, if you go, the coral reefs and surrounding waters are estimated to harbor over 245 rare species across dozens of genera and families of aquatic life. And when it comes to humans, this island is inhabited by some of the most ancient tribal groups. Deep in the island's interiors live the Shompen, a hunter-gatherer tribe numbering barely 350. Only 350 of them exist, and who have inhabited these forests for centuries and avoid all contact with the outside world. So they virtually live like our cavemen did. There are also about 450 Nicobaris that had to resettle after the 2004 tsunami destroyed their homes. And this is not a vacant frontier. As you can see, it is teeming with extraordinary life, which is why the verdict of the National Green Tribunal has landed like a thunderclap for ecologists. Now let's get into the details of this very controversial 81,000 crore rupees port and defense project that the NGT has cleared. And this was recently, as recent as February 16th. And the centerpiece of this, of the Great Nicobar Island project is a rupees 44,000 crore international container transshipment terminal. That's what it is called. And this is planned for Galathea Bay. Other parts of the project that will be spread across 166 square kilometers of the island include a 400 megawatt green power plant and a greenfield airport. Now, this airport is planned for dual civil-military use. There are also an ecotourism and a residential township designed to house around 125,000 people. But the defense component, including a possible naval base, was not made public. The details were disclosed to the tribunal or the NGT in a sealed envelope citing national security, and the NGT did not reveal the details, and therefore we have to go by whatever is public knowledge. The NGT verdict caps a 3-year legal battle that began when ecologist Ashish Kothari filed a petition challenging the project's environmental clearance. The tribunal, or the NGT, upheld the clearance made by the environment clearance that was asked by an expert, that was given by an expert committee, but made the clearance contingent on strict enforcement of the safeguards prescribed in that clearance. However, the most critical aspect would be enforcement. Now, ecologists have doubts of whether it would be enforced well because in a project of this scale and an island ecosystem of this sensitivity, the difference between what is on paper and what actually happens on ground will decide whether a wilderness of this magnitude survives the planned development and the onslaught on its resources. The Modi government is firm. It sees Great Nicobar Island project as a strategic linchpin. Union Environment Minister Bhupender Yadav hailed the tribunal's decision, and in an interview with me, told me that the project was of great defense, national security, and strategic significance. And he said it will strengthen India's presence in the Andaman Sea and Southeast Asia while creating an economic hub with a major transshipment terminal. The minister also framed it as an imperative that offers, as he put it, immense opportunities to strengthen India's trading position in the world. He also told me that the ministry was committed, and this is what he made it a point to say, that the ministry is committed to implement the stringent environment management plan that the NGT had imposed while clearing the project. So he said, look, I'm clear, we will protect the environment. But the criticism from legal and environmental experts has been harsh and blunt. Environmental lawyer Ritwik Datta says that there is nothing in the judgment to show the application of technical knowledge or the use of subject experts within the bench, the NGT, and he states that the case appears to have been dealt with as a limited judicial review, essentially asking whether procedure was followed rather than deeply assessing the ecological risk and preventing environmental degradation. So, according to him, the NGT went through just a kind of a paperwork approval that was there, looking at all the files that were sent to them, but really didn't use expertise to get down and drill it and ensure that it is preventing environmental degradation. That's the criticism. And there are other experts who flag other problems. One is, as I mentioned earlier, the weak compliance with safeguards after clearances are granted. And they point out that the NGT itself, the tribunal itself, is functioning at half its prescribed strength. And for environmentalists, this verdict is a setback because they believe that even though it has put stringent conditions for clearance, these may not be implemented properly. And therefore, their hope now shifts to the Calcutta High Court, where several petitions, including those filed by Ashish Kothari, whom I mentioned earlier, are being heard. So the courts will take the final call on this, though the NGT's ruling is very, very significant. But beyond the legal sphere, the project has become politically charged too. Now, Congress leader Sonia Gandhi had described it earlier as being pushed through insensitively, making a mockery of legal and deliberative processes. That's what she said. And Rahul Gandhi also earlier flagged alleged regulatory violations and potential impacts on tribal communities. But the most vocal critic was former Union Minister Jairam Ramesh, and he has called the project an environmental and humanitarian disaster. That's his words. And after the verdict, Jairam Ramesh said the conditions referred to by the NGT would do little to deal with the long-term consequences, and he called the petitions that are in the Calcutta High Court and the proceedings that are pending over there the only beacon of hope. So the conflict is now stark. On one side, as I've pointed out, there is strategy, trade, national ambition. On the other, ecological risk, indigenous rights, and the fear of irreversible loss of some magnificent natural beauty and in terms of almost like a paradise, if you'd like to call it that way. To understand why the government remains committed, let's first look at the commercial argument. Remember, I had mentioned earlier that they look at this as a strategic port, and ministry officials argue the port is designed to tap shipping business along the east-west shipping corridor, given the proximity of this island to the Strait of Malacca, which is said to be just about 100 to 200 kilometers away. So if you look at the map and see where the Great Nicobar Island is there, you will find it closer to Indonesia than it is to, say, Kanyakumari. That's how deep the islands go into and reach the Indian Ocean across that entire, almost bow-shaped group of islands that the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are. And the Great Nicobar Island is that last big stretch that is there that virtually abuts Indonesia and that very critical Malacca Strait. So the proposed Galatea Bay International Container Transshipment Terminal, or ICTT as it is called, is envisioned with an eventual capacity of what is called 16 million TEUs, which mean 20-foot equivalent units, which is a container term, and will be handling large intercontinental cargo ships, and they will then shift this cargo to smaller feeder vessels that serve ports across the Bay of Bengal, the Andaman Sea, and the Arabian Sea. Now, just to put it simply, because of the deep waters of the Great Nicobar Island, large container ships can come and berth over there, and they can then, smaller ships come and bring the container to whichever destination, whether India or across the other places. And this facility this is the second such facility in India after the Vizhinjam International Seaport near Thiruvananthapuram, which was inaugurated in May last year. Here's the key statistics in the government's pitch, the Modi government's pitch. India's foreign transshipment requirement is currently estimated at about 3 million TEUs, which annually, if you take it, it's just a rough estimate that requires 200 of the largest container ships. Now, much of this traffic is currently handled by Colombo and Singapore. Again, look at the map and you can see why. and the cost is of this transshipment is estimated to be around $200 million, which roughly translates to about rupees 1,800 crore annually. Now, Vizhinjam can currently handle about 1 million TEUs of transshipment cargo. Great Nicobar is projected to handle 4 million TEU in phase 1, which is to be ready by 2028, and will scale up to 16 million over 25 years. So it will become, if this project goes through, India's largest terminal for cargo transshipment. I mean, it's going to be the biggest, because as I had mentioned earlier, even the one at Thiruvananthapuram is only going to be about 4 million. This is going to be really, really huge in size. And since it's located barely 40 nautical miles from the Strait of Malacca, this terminal aims to capture not only India-bound transshipment traffic, but also some international cargo, now routed through Colombo and Singapore, provided, of course, it proves cost-effective. So the gamble is there. There's a bet that is going on in the hope that if India sets up this giant transshipment terminal, it would get the kind of business, not just that India is doing, which we estimate currently at around $200 million, but across the region, there'll be a whole lot of countries interested in having an additional transshipment post that could bring costs down significantly. We spoke to Union Shipping Minister Sarbananda Sonowal, and he told India Today that the ICTT at the Great Nicobar Island, the proposed transshipment port, will make India a leading maritime nation. And he argued that if ship liners berth in India or berth at the Nicobar, India grows its income and also provides huge employment. So there is a win-win in his mind. But there is a counter-argument. Now, some maritime policy experts, and I'll name one, a former naval officer, Abhijit Singh, who wrote a very incisive column recently on it, and he argued in that column that the rationale for locating an ICTT on an international transshipment cargo transshipment terminal on the Great Nicobar Island is completely flawed. And he points out that unlike Colombo, Great Nicobar has no urban center, no industrial hinterland, no established logistics backbone to sustain port-led growth. His warning is pointed. Ambition divorced from economic and logistical realities is no recipe for success. Now, that's a warning that all the experts should look at, because India cannot be investing such huge amounts, plus the environmental cost, if that particular project does not prove viable and the Indian government ends up spending, that means our tax money gets into it. So there has to be a very clear assessment of what this transshipment port will not only cost, but how will the money come back in terms of revenue, and will it meet the costs of whatever was invested on it. So as I said, there is a question about viability, and some of the questions that experts ask is, will the port attract the volumes needed to justify the cost, and of course the ecological trade-offs. Now let's look at the other major reason for the project, the defense of India. And again, go back to that map of India, if you have it with you, and you'll see that the Andaman and Nicobar archipelago straddles key sea lanes of the Indian Ocean. And defense experts say it is a natural outpost for monitoring and potentially countering maritime activity, including China, which for India is a big thing. India already operates the Integrated Andaman and Nicobar Command, or ANC, at Port Blair. It is described as a maritime surveillance hub, tracking naval movement in the eastern Indian Ocean and the Strait of Malacca, and acting as a forward operating base towards Southeast Asia. Now, further south, India maintains a naval air station, INS Baz, as it is called, at Campbell Bay on the Great Nicobar stretch of islands, and this supports maritime patrol and surveillance missions and limited fighter deployment. All these islands are undergoing steady military upgrades. There are airfields, jetties, storage surveillance systems all across the Andaman and Nicobar Island. And so some experts argue that a defense establishment in the Great Nicobar Island close to the Strait of Malacca gives India logistical depth, along with, because there are major shipping arteries over there, and that enables more rapid deployment and also serves as a logistic node for international partners. We spoke to former Navy Chief Admiral Arun Prakash, who was the first Commander-in-Chief of the Andaman and Nicobar Center that we talked about, the tri-service base that we talked about. And he said, he was very, very clear. He said India's island-based forces can monitor and required interdict trade and energy routes across the Bay of Bengal. And he highlights China's vulnerability, where he says key sea lanes are long and a significant stretch crosses the Bay of Bengal. And he says that he is very clear that the Great Nicobar Island project, which will also have a naval component, is vital for India's security. But of course, there are skeptics who ask that why does a military mission need a commercial megaport? Also, if INS bars already support surveillance, what exactly is the added defense value, especially when the details are not public? So that is something that the government and experts have to look at, whether we really need to have this major port that is there, and how do they justify establishing another naval establishment in the Nicobar Island when they already have a whole series of them outside. So to sum up, this is the heart of the Great Nicobar controversy. The merging of commercial and strategic rationales and the secrecy around the defense component. But finally, let's look at the ecological case. We examined why it is important for commercial reasons, the trade reasons, where if a major port comes out, how does it benefit India? We've also looked at the defense of India and the security aspect. Finally, let's look at this ecological case, which is, as ecologists say, deeply worrying. Now, they have flagged three broad areas of concern. There are a lot of concerns, but I'm boiling it down to just three. First, they fear the destruction of virgin tropical forests in the Great Nicobar Island. Now, according to government submissions, the project would require clearing 130 square kilometers of dense tropical forest, and if you convert that into trees, it's close to 7 lakh trees. Yes, if you convert that to other figures, it's close to 3/4 of a million trees. 3/4 of a million trees, 750,000 trees are expected to be cut. Now, the minister says even after diversion of land, 82% of the island will remain under forest cover, and this aligns well with the National Forest Policy benchmark, way above that benchmark that is required for a state like Andaman and Nicobar to maintain its forest, the entire forest area that it has. Environmentalists call the figure misleading and saying that the project could fell as much as 15% of precious forests in the Great Nicobar Island. And then, of course, there's this compensatory afforestation, because anywhere if you cut forests, any establishment has to plant forests elsewhere. And the government argues that because the Andaman and Nicobar Islands already has enough forest, they plan to locate this a forestry program in Haryana and Madhya Pradesh, and say they will establish double the number of forests that they have diverted in the Nicobar Island. But critics again question the ecological logic of replacing ancient island rainforests with plantations in an entirely different ecosystem. And that sounds strange. A lot of people saying, look, if you have to give compensation, give it right back to the Andaman and Nicobar Island people. They deserve the money more than anything else, rather than go by government rules. That is something that the government needs to look at. Let's look at the second big threat that ecologists say, and that is towards this magnificent biodiversity that the Great Nicobar Islands have. Its beaches, including the Galathea Bay that I talked about earlier, host roughly 650 nesting sites of the endangered leatherback turtles. The fear is that increased port activity, dredging, noise, light, shoreline changes, all could imperil not only the hatchling survival, but would discourage females from coming back to their birthing, to the place where they're born, and laying their eggs over there. So this is something that a lot of ecologists say could happen, because of the increased shipping movement as well as the disturbances and dredging that is going around. Now, the ministry points to a leatherback reserve and says it has established a separate reserve for them. It also has a megapod sanctuary and a coral sanctuary. But environmentalists remain unconvinced about the adequacy of such measures. So the ministry says, look, we are creating reserves and we're ensuring that if there is some problem here, we are making sure that there is enough protected reserves for these wildlife. Now, conservation, the ecologists also warn that there would be a massive influx of people that could trigger cascading damage to the island. There is going to be waste and pollution. Remember, I told you that there's going to be a city that is going to be developed over there with over 125,000 people, when the current population is barely what we had talked about, 750 or a little more than 1,000. So you'd get a huge influx which will cause waste and pollution, freshwater scarcity, and there would be invasive species, fragmentation of the remaining forest. That's the threat that it poses. And the estimate is that the population could swell from, say, about what we have in all 8,500 to about 650,000 by 2050. And this is, if you're looking at the entire Andaman and Nicobar archipelago, there's lesser than few hundred and 450,000 people. So that's a whole lot of people going to come in, and that could cause its own problems. Of course, the stakes extend beyond the Great Nicobar Island itself to the surrounding seas that are there, those magnificent emerald and blue beaches and seas that are there. And below them, under the sea, the coral reefs are already stressed by the warming of sea waters, and these play a crucial role in marine biodiversity across the Andaman Sea and the Bay of Bengal. Their degradation can ripple outwards, affecting fisheries and ocean health. Of course, the Ministry of Environment says that they have they have great plans to protect the corals in that area and, if necessary, translocate them. They also point out that they found no coral islands in the project area that they're working, but there are some, and they will ensure the surrounding areas will be protected, and if necessary, some of these coral families could be translocated. Of course, let's finally then come to the human question, which is really the tribal question. And this is the third major area of disquiet that we would look at. And essentially, what would be the impact of the project on the Great Nicobar's indigenous communities that I mentioned earlier, the Shompen and the Nicobarese, and their unique way of life? Now, as much as 84 square kilometers or about 11% of the tribal reserve falls within the project area, the government says it secured the consent of these tribes. But in January this year, the head of the tribal council told the media that once he realized the extent of land being sought, he wrote withdrawing the consent that was given about 2 years earlier. Now, the minister, Bhupendra Yadav, whom I spoke to, has categorically stated that Shompen and Nicobarese settlements in the areas which are called Rajiv Nagar and the New Shingen will not be displaced. And the ministry claims a net gain for the tribal reserve through re-notified areas elsewhere. So they're saying overall the tribals will be protected, and there's a 50-year plan to protect the tribal interest that is there. But Manish Chandi, a social ecologist whom we spoke to, who has studied indigenous islanders for more than 2 decades, warns that global experience shows hunter-gatherer communities like the Shompen, exposed to modern infrastructure projects, suffer extremely adverse impacts. They have chosen their life, he says, and an alternate one cannot be imposed. And the unease, of course, deepens because the island is not only ecologically fragile, it is geologically vulnerable. Greater Nicobar falls in the seismic zone 5, the highest hazard region. Data cited from the United States Geological Survey shows that between 2010 and 2020, just 10 years, 442 earthquakes happened in that region, ranging from a magnitude 4 to 6.6 magnitude. Now, all this occurred within a 150-kilometer radius, indicating an average of 44 earthquakes a year. The 2004 tsunami stands as testimony to the destruction that seismic activity like earthquakes can inflict. A large population living on the island, experts warn, or could be at massive risk. The ministry, when asked, says the possibility of another 2004-like mega earthquake is low, citing seismologists who say such incidents recur only in long cycles of over 400 to 700 years. But the risk is not only about frequency, it's about consequences. And senior ministry officials say that they have gone in the Great Nicobar Island project. They've gone way beyond their usual remit and have set up multiple committees to oversee pollution, biodiversity threats, and tribal welfare. And this, they will continue, it'll be a continuous process and will ensure that all the various commitments they made, environmental commitments to protect the island they've made, would be implemented. And he says this is unusual because normally the ministry doesn't make those kind of commitments, but this has been a special case for the Great Nicobar Island. The legal battle continues in the Calcutta High Court, where petitions from ecologists challenging the project are continuing to be heard. Now, as the battle rages, the Great Nicobar Island project captures a larger national dilemma. How does India balance economic ambition and strategic imperatives with environmental conservation and the rights of indigenous people without irreparably damaging one of India's last great wildernesses? That's the big question we'll have to think over carefully and answer, and it's for you and us to do so. But for an in-depth report on the Great Nicobar Island controversy, do read the cover story in India Today, which I wrote jointly with my colleague Rahul Narona, with inputs from the India Today team. Thank you for being with me in this episode of Nothing But the Truth. I look forward to having you with me next week. Nothing But the Truth.